Chris.
All right.
How are you, man?
Good, good. How are you doing?
I'm really good. So just a personal issue before we go to the public one, but Rosario Dawson last night, talking with her, and when I tell her that I was doing something with you today, she gets wildly excited. I'm like, wait a minute, I don't get that excited. I don't get the enthusiasm, but
Well, the only one who gets as excited for me is my brother, who is a constituent and such a huge fan of yours. So he says to me, he says, "Can I tune in?" I said, "I don't know. Do you have an Instagram account?" I think he created an Instagram account just so he can hear you on today.
Well, let me just tell you, because how long have you been in Washington, man?
I've been about 3 years.
Yeah, for 3 years in DC. You're one of these people who is like hits this place with an impact that is really amazing, and your reputation nationally has just grown lion size. Frankly, you're just seen as one of these common sense, pragmatic progressives who articulates things in a way that you get people saying, huh, from all over the political spectrum, are so compelling. I just really believe, and I don't know if you'll stay in Congress and what your future plans are, because I just think that you are going to be one of those people that really helps to advance this nation, because you've become such an incredible voice for common sense progressive change that is good for everybody. You could speak to business people, you could speak to fiscal conservatives, and explain why doing things have a multiplier of an effect. And one area, you and I partnered on a lot of things, but I just love how you can see the whole field in three-dimensionally. And for me, you speak to a lot of areas of my passion and interest. And one of them is marijuana, which we've worked on together. And I say, yeah.
In a sense, time to praise you, Senator Booker.
Screw praising me, for crying out loud. What I want is talking about, like, you. I was listening to you one morning, interviewed on some show where the guy started talking about your district with such specificity, and you were like, "Oh, I appreciate that. I think it might have been good." I said, "I really think the only thing keeping you from being the top political voice in the country,
oh please,
only thing that's keeping you from doing that is you have not shaved your head yet." And I think if you make that choice,
my hair is growing, and depending how good I am to my wife is whether I get a haircut from her or not. So I've got to earn the right to get a haircut from her.
I will come to your office if we want to do it for a cause. I literally have clippers in my office, man. How do you think I keep this dome so shiny?
I couldn't pull that off. There are a lot of places we can collaborate, but I can't pull off your sense of style, Cory.
All right, let's talk policy, man. Let's talk policy.
Yes, let's do it. But I do want to say one thing about you, because you have what is so important about you. I mean, there are a lot of things I can say. But you take all of the progressive policies that are as progressive as you can get, and you make the case about why those progressive policies are actually good for our economic growth, why they're good for the country. You've been doing it when you were mayor of New Jersey. You've been doing it your entire career. And here's why that's so important, and why your voice indispensable in the country. Coalition. And what you're doing is taking the 30-40%, and you're talking to everyone else, and you're saying, you know what? If we invest in education, healthcare, this is actually good for the nation. It's good for everyone. And I thought you did that the best in the presidential field in terms of the pro-growth kind of progressive policy. You're continuing to do that.
Well, I love that, and I'm hoping this is the beginning of many of our Facebook lives, Instagram lives, because you and I just feel a kinship with you. Like, take an issue like maternal mortality, for example, and that we're the bottom of all the developed nations in terms of maternal mortality rates. African American women 3 to 4 times. People don't think that should be enough to motivate us to have change. But if you're just like looking at the balance sheet analysis, it costs so much more to our society to have such rates of maternal mortality and infant mortality that even it would be cheaper to get doula care for every at-risk pregnancy or every low-income woman than it would be to continue to pay the exorbitant costs of those complications at birth. And so your ability
And
to...
I love that you make that point, right? Because I mean, there's so many people speak to that, but we often forget, and we allow the Republicans, in my view, to have this argument that their policies are going to grow the economy, their policies are common sense. It turns out they're actually wrong. It turns out that our policies are the ones that are investing in people's human potential, that are investing, as you gave an example, in terms of cost-efficient measures, and that we ought to be making the economic case. And I know, I know it's not always, it doesn't always get you the massive viral tweets. It doesn't get you often the loudest voice heard. But I'll tell you something. When you look at actual people on the ground, they turn their heads and they say, you know what? That he's talking in a language that's different, and we can get behind that. And your whole point is, how do we become a multiracial, inclusive, multi-ethnic democracy? And you know how much respect I have for that.
No, and look, the great thing about this crisis, and I say the great thing about this crisis, there's a great Hebrew phrase, Gamza Latova, and everything there is some good. And my hope is that the good out of this is that it's expanded our circles of empathy for each other, that we are seeing each other better and the importance we are to each other, how much we depend on each other in ways that we don't really even know. And by exposing vulnerabilities at times, it can motivate change, like a horrible bombing at a church in Birmingham in the 60s, or the early 1900s, a fire at the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire. All of these tragedies, these crises, actually helped us to leap forward. And, like something that, like the homeless issue in America, understanding that is something that affects us all. But again, I still remember I was a mayor and I went to Seattle to speak to this housing organization that did supportive housing for Americans with mental illness who are homeless. And they just studied what's more expensive to society, to leave people on the streets or to put them in supportive housing, which is expensive. And they found out that they were saving Seattle like $1 million for every 20 or so people that they brought into supportive housing, because they ended up in jails and emergency rooms. And so here we are at a moment that I think that all of us and all of the people listening, the challenge and the urgency we have, I think, is taking the heart hurt that we have right now and turning it into action on policy. And the thing that you and I are trying to talk about today is something that has deeply bothered me. And I started looking at it a few years ago when I went out west and met with farmers in the Midwest, including Republican farmers, that's going on in our food sector that has led to the mass extinction of the independent family farmers who are going out of business at rates that are stunning. Their share of the consumer dollar has gone down about 50% because it's being gobbled up by these big corporate multinational corporations who are now dominating the markets and hurting these independent family farmers. But even worse, all of our subsidies here in Washington, 90% of them go not to diversity within our food system, not to the things that we are told by another branch of government that we should be eating, but go to 4 monocrops that really just through these philosophies that bigger and bigger is better, when that's just not the case for environmental reasons, for the well-being of farmers, for the well-being of our consumers and society. So you and I have a bill that I'm really excited about that really goes after these big meatpacking multinational corporations and more. And I didn't know if you wanted.
Oh, great. Well, you've been such an intellectual leader on this, really come up with a framework, but it's really pretty simple. I mean, when people think of farmers and standing up for family farmers, they aren't thinking of gigantic corporations. And what they're thinking about is a farm, maybe their kids, their uncles, their relatives in business and supporting them. And yet what we've seen is those family farms are disappearing. They're getting stuck with the liability. I mean, imagine this, the pollution or things that are going on is being caused by these large corporations. And then they have the contract farmers, not only are they not getting the benefits, but they also are getting stuck with the liability. And what you said is, look, this isn't fair. This isn't right. We need to actually, if you care about farmers, and some people in politics, they love mentioning farmer every third word in the tweets or other things, and that's their strategy. But like, how about actually having policies that help farmers and actually are supporting them? And then from Silicon Valley, I could tell you, and I know you spent time out there in school. I mean, the key to Silicon Valley is you don't just want a few companies, right? You want hundreds of startups. You want hundreds of people in the economy. That's what creates dynamism. That's what creates innovation. So one of the challenges is we only have 4 companies controlling in the meat packing or livestock industry or in certain crops. Then you're much more susceptible to shocks like we've seen in this pandemic. You don't have the same diversity. You don't have the same consumer choice. You don't have the same innovation. So I think what we're proposing is actually a pro-market reform. Let's have more entrants. Let's have more people. Let's have more small business. Let's not have this concentration in the top that's hurting innovation.
Yeah, I love that. And I just want to give a horrible picture of the way this works in Duplin County, North Carolina, where I went down to look at the pig farming that was there. And it comes to turn out that these companies like Smithfield, massive multinational corporations, they have these contract farmers that are now like sharecroppers. They're dictated every element. They are forced to buy whatever facilities they dictate. They're forced to do non-transparent competitions against each other. And now they're doing these pigs in a way that they're genetically modified or animals that are bred in certain ways. They're all packed in these massive covered long slides out into these massive lagoons that I saw that are then pumped up into these fields and sprayed out onto the fields. The people in that neighborhood, I met with them in a big building where they just told me stories about not being able to open their windows anymore, not to be able to run their air conditioning or put their clothing on the line, and how their rivers and streams are becoming polluted. And so you have this system that overuses antibiotics. If the wet markets, which I led over here in the Senate effort to shut them down, it's the same thing with the way we're raising animals now, so different than our grandparents, that makes these half of our antibiotics are being injected into animals in these close quarters that make the possibility for antibiotic resistant diseases to emerge. So here you have this system that when storms come through North Carolina, picking up all of that filth and putting it, more of it, into the rivers. So here you have systems that are hurting these contract farmers, systems that are hurting our environment, systems that are hurting the communities in which they're there, systems that are fighting against competition and the way we used to do practices. And so our bill is very simple. It goes after these big corporate farms that are violating all the edicts of what antitrust law is supposed to be about. We reaffirm this idea of using the Packers and Stockyard Act that was all about keeping this corporate consolidation from the business, and now regulators are turned the other way. We make a $10 billion investment in helping farmers who are caught in these impossible situations to transition into sustainable farming and the kind of things that actually raise their profits. And we make sure, frankly, in our bill, that we are supporting workers as well, and ending a lot of these practices that have been so corrosive. And so it's a very common sense bill. We had a big benefit that, along with you and I, we've got the Elizabeth Warren now that signed on with us. That we go to our supermarkets and we don't really know the systems that are so destructive that we're participating in by not having healthy food systems.
Well, I appreciate that, Cory. And you've been sounding this alarm for years, and now you've gotten some of us to pay attention and to really see what you're talking about and the depth with which your team has constructed this policy. I would just say one thing that, Matt Russell, who I know as well, and has worked with farmers on regenerative agriculture and climate change. I mean, he talks about how we have to respect the dignity of farmers and empower them. That we shouldn't be having things done to farmers, but empower them to do things. And the reality is when you have these large corporations, how to have no-tilling agriculture or all of the things that people know far more than I do about it. I'll tell you what I want. I want the farmers actually in charge. I don't want you or I telling them what to do, and I don't want big corporations telling them what to do. I want the people who are closest to the land, who understand the land, having the creativity and being empowered. And I think what this legislation does is it's a bet on small business and small farmers, their creativity and ingenuity, and not having them caught up in these large bureaucracies where they can't be creative.
And so so real quick, because my staff is like sending me text messages here about all the questions, but I just want to tell you this one story. They bring me out to this group of farmers, most of them Republicans. I still remember the guy greeted me kind of like, with a stern, and he asked me to go look at his farm first. So we went down to the land, and I'm a vegan, as you know, but I looked at his cows, and I tried to loosen him up by making every dad joke I have about cows. I said, "Sir, your cows are utterly amazing, sir." And he smiled finally, and I'm like, this. I'm going to loin a great lesson from you about farming here, sir. And he chuckled. And then unfortunately, I went too far when I told him I was going to milk this moment for everything I could. Anyway, we got into his house, and it was amazing because when we started talking about the anti-competitive practices that they were dealing with and how they used to, their parents, and in the past had like 5 people to sell their goods to, and now they only had one that was dictating to them price. One of the guys was actually afraid to open up to me because what they would do to people that would cause trouble is just cut them off. And now they have nobody to send their goods to. I was stunned. By the end of it, we're all getting along so much because Democrat Republican means nothing. We all wanted to see these the original small businesses in America, our farmers, be able to thrive and not be caught up in these anti-competitive monopolistic practices. And so I'm just excited that we are seeing people take this on. And let me ask these questions here. So the question number 1 is from Rebecca on Twitter. We're doing cross platforms here. That's the way we roll. She says, "Thank you to both of us for our leadership. Can you share how we can organize to add more of your colleagues to this bill and help get it passed?"
That's a great question, Rebecca. And I think what we need to say is this is not a progressive bill. It's not just a Democrat bill. This is a bill that everyone will be able to get behind. It's about empowering farmers, small businesses. It's about making sure that they have dignity. And so what I would say is, look, I can help get most progressive caucus in the House, probably before. We're actually to go talk to some of the folks in the New Democratic Coalition, talk to some Republicans. Let's get a very broad coalition for this, and not make it partisan, or not make this progressive versus not, but make that empowering sort of farmer on support country.
Awesome, and I want to add to that that Food and Water Watch is an endorser of our bill, and they're doing. Here's another one for you, Ro. Vivian on Twitter asks, "How can we make all meat production safer and cleaner? Is there a way to support smaller, sustainable farmers?" That's exciting.
Well, and I want your take on that too, but it seems such an urgent question when we've seen these horrendous pandemic breakouts in these meat industries. And no humanity, but people literally who are doing this work so that the rest of us can have food on the table are subjecting themselves to horrendous conditions, risk to their health, risk to their family's health. So first, I would just start by saying, look, we need basic safety standards, basic worker rights. That if you're going to a meat packing facility, if you're going to an Amazon warehouse so I can get my package, then you ought to have social distancing, you ought to have protective gear, you ought to have making those decisions. And this is not just for blame the corporations. This is all of us who benefit from an economy where people are doing this work. We have a responsibility to do that. And I think what our bill does by making sure you don't just have market power by companies, is we give farmers, workers a lot more choice. Because if the only game in town is 3 or 4 big companies, then you probably don't have much choice in terms of how safe those conditions are. But now suddenly, if you've got 15, 20, 30 producers, or you've got a lot more people producing, and then if there's a company that's abusing workers or not being safe, that's not going to fly. And so that's one area. But I know you've thought a lot about this, so why don't you share your perspective?
Well, the only thing I would add to that is just the key element of our bill about investing back into family farmers and to small farmers and helping them transition out of these awful contract relationships. I've been able to meet with a lot of people in the farmers union around our country who know that if farmers are giving a chance to compete, they can not only thrive and provide the food that we want, but they can actually also do great practices of, engaging in practices to help with our environment, like more cover crops, things that pull carbon out of the air. And if we create revenue streams for them doing that, like if you go out in Iowa, I spent a little bit of time in Iowa last year. I don't know if you heard about that. If you go out to Iowa, you see all these. Thank you. You see all these wind turbines on the farms, and because that's a source of revenue for farmers. We've got to start figuring out ways to empower economically our farmers to be the leaders on food system security, the leaders on environmental protection. There's so many things we can do for water quality with farming practices, with dealing with the carbon problem. And that's why our bill really has an important way, about $10 billion to help farmers engage in these practices and liberate themselves from these multinational corporations that just want to gobble them up or put them in contracts that make their lives so difficult. Let's see if we can do one more here before we go. And I'm actually going to go to the Instagram itself and see what we can find here. Let's see on this issue, and I think that maybe that's the last question I'll make, which is that there's a lot of things we just need to educate people on, from how the prescription drug companies are getting over, for example, things I didn't know about before I became a senator, like PBMs and more, so that we understand the actions that we need to take to actually make a real change when it comes to the end consumer. This is a really pressing area, and I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts about how folks can do things. And I'll give you one more example, because my New Year's resolution before the world turned upside down, but I'm still focusing on it, was just to think more about me as a consumer in certain areas. So I did that in food for a long time. Now I'm trying to do it with my clothing and know where that comes from. So I'm not participating in systems that are unjust unconsciously. And the more you know, the better you do. And often it doesn't mean you have to buy more expensive things. It's just making sure that you're buying from places that produce clothing that's more in line with your values. So I'm just wondering, Ro, like for a lot of us, busy, crazy, stressed, how can we, what do you suggest people do to be more aware of some of the problems we're talking about and try to make a difference in their own lives, as well as in the larger efforts for justice?
Well, that's very profound, and I appreciate your clothing example, because I know you've been like me, inspired by Gandhi, and of course, as you know, my grandfather had spent 4 years there, and that was in his independence movement in jail, and that was the thrust of the Indian independence movement, was an awareness of where the clothes were being made, and that's why even in the Indian flag you have the spinning your own clothing. And so I know your roots in terms of your activism and civil rights activism and movements of justice come from a very deep place. But I think there are two things that everyone can do. First, which our approach, I think, in this bill has been, the actual farmers. Let's listen to communities that are being affected and hear their ideas and have them drive this. And I think when you talk like you did about paying farmers to be engaged in processes of regenerative agriculture, it's so important that they don't feel defensive or lectured at when we talk about climate change or talk about a greater responsibility. People who are farmers have the most respect, most love for the land and the planet than anyone. And I think just the tone we take when we say, look, we believe in you. What can we do to make you an agent of change, and how do we reward that? I think that goes a long way. And then all of us can just be more aware of supporting independent farmers and factory farmers in the choices we make, whether that's the restaurant we frequent, whether it's the grocery store we frequent, and what we buy there. I think the more consumer demand there is, the better the chance we have of success. But I want to just thank you again for it. It was not easy what you did. It was certainly not easy. It's certainly not a politically necessarily popular position to do what you're doing, because you're taking on some established about what's right for farmers, for the community, for the environment. And I think in the long run, my view is good policy and truth wins. It may take a long, long run, but in the long run, that always succeeds. And I admire that that's the place you come from in your career.
Well, I'm more grateful than you know. I love that you mentioned your answer. This guy who was in my office, I learned so much from studying him and really how he tried to in many ways align his life with his beliefs, and that consistency and that integrity. And you live that spirit as well, my friend, and I'm grateful for you. And this is an area that I did not come to the Senate knowing that I would be so involved in. But the more I learned and the more I saw the injustices facing farmers, facing consumers, the more I was just somebody that was really frustrated with the United States of America, from prescription